I'm Lauren Parker. I'm 29 years old, and on the night everything changed, I was sitting at my parents' old oak dining table cutting into a piece of roast chicken, thinking it was just another quiet weeknight. My dad set his fork down, folded his arms across his chest, and told me I had 30 days to get out because they'd sold the house. For a second, the sound in the room just dropped away like somebody had pulled the plug on the world. My mom stared at her plate as if the peas on it were the most important thing she'd ever seen, and my sisters smirked like they'd been waiting for this moment for years. They thought they were finally pushing me out of their world, finally getting rid of the extra child who never fit. What they didn't realize was that the house they just sold wasn't slipping out from under me. If everything went the way I planned, it was on its way to being mine. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to stand on your own 2 feet when the people closest to you expected you to fall. I grew up in this same house, a 2-story place on a quiet street with a maple tree out front, and a porch that needed repainting every couple of years, the kind of house most people would describe as nothing fancy but home. My parents liked to talk about hard work and responsibility, about how our family pulled together when things were tight, how we weren't like those people who wasted money on things they didn't need. On paper, it sounded like a set of solid values, and as a little girl, I believed every word of it, repeating those phrases back to teachers and friends as if they were a promise that I belonged somewhere safe. We weren't rich and we weren't poor. My dad worked at a local hardware store. My mom took on part-time jobs here and there, and we watched every dollar like it could sprout legs and run away. At least that was the story they told. The truth was that my place in that house never felt quite as secure as the mortgage they complained about paying. By the time I was old enough to notice the difference between what people say and what they actually do, I could see the way my parents' eyes changed when they looked at Megan and Chloe compared to me. Megan got the proud smiles, the "you're going places" speeches, the late-night drives to practice, and the new shoes for every season. Chloe got the indulgent laughs, the "she's still young" excuses, the kind of soft landing that meant her mistakes barely left a bruise. With me, the tone shifted. Suddenly, talks about hard work sounded more like lectures, and questions about my future came wrapped in disappointment before I even answered. Still, I tried to live up to the values they claimed to care about, taking extra shifts at part-time jobs, learning to stretch a dollar further than it had any right to go, teaching myself things late at night on a second-hand laptop while everyone else slept. I didn't leave home right after high school the way some people do, partly because there was no money to help me go anywhere, and partly because I told myself I could get on my feet faster if I stayed and saved. I rented a tiny dorm room during semesters and came back to my childhood bedroom in between a room with peeling posters on the walls and a closet that still smelled faintly of old textbooks and laundry detergent. Every time I set my suitcase down at the foot of that narrow bed, my dad would remind me how much water and electricity cost, and my mom would mention bills as if my presence alone made the numbers rise. I picked up freelance coding work wherever I could, building small programs for local shops, taking customer calls from that creaky desk in the corner, and sending money straight into a savings account I didn't talk about. To my parents, I was just the oldest daughter who hadn't quite launched, lingering too long in a house they considered theirs. On the day of that dinner, the house smelled like roasted garlic and lemon, and the late evening light slanted through the blinds, catching the dust that always floated above the table. Megan was talking about her classes, leaning back in her chair like she owned the place, while Chloe scrolled on her phone and laughed at something only she could see. My dad barely looked at me while we ate. He just carved the chicken past the dishes, and then, without any let-up at all, said in that flat, managerial voice of his that the house had been sold, and I had 1 month to find somewhere else to live. There was no "we need to talk," no conversation about plans or options, just a deadline dropped in the middle of the meal like another side dish. My mom kept her eyes down, tracing circles on the tablecloth with the tip of her fork, and when I looked at her, it was like staring at a closed door. I asked when they'd made the decision, how long the house had been on the market, why no one had bothered to clue me in, and my dad just leaned back and said they didn't owe me an explanation. He told me the new owners would deal with me if I wasn't gone in time, like I was a broken appliance they were leaving behind in the garage. Megan hid a smile behind her glass of iced tea, and Chloe muttered something about park benches and cardboard boxes, her voice light and sing-song, as if homelessness were a joke you toss across the table. The word my dad used for me that night was burden, and it landed heavier than the news about the sale, heavier than the deadline, heavier than the thought of trying to find a place in 30 days. It wasn't the first time he'd made me feel that way, but it was the first time he'd said it so plainly, with the paperwork already in motion. I excused myself after the plates were cleared, climbed the familiar stairs to my room, and closed the door softly, letting the quiet wrap around me. The same bed, the same dresser, the same narrow window facing the street, but everything felt different, like someone had tilted the floor and I had to plant my feet, not to slide. I sat on the edge of the mattress and looked around at the life I'd been building in secret, the laptop on the desk, with half a dozen projects open, the stack of notebooks full of ideas that had nothing to do with this house, the printed contract for the software company Noah and I had filed under the radar. My parents thought they were finally forcing me into the world with nothing, as if I hadn't already stepped into it on my own years ago. As I lay back and stared at the ceiling, I realized that this was the last time they were going to blindside me in their dining room. They believed the sale gave them all the power that 30 days was enough to remind me who controlled the roof over my head. What they didn't know was that I had already started to imagine another outcome the first time I saw this house appear in a real estate listing my old bedroom on display like it belonged to anyone who happened to click. They had no idea that while they were talking about new neighborhoods and fresh starts, I was running numbers and reading contracts, listening more carefully to the language of ownership than to anything they said at the table. For most of my life, they had treated this house as proof that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of space and attention they gave me. As I closed my eyes that night, the words "you're out" still echoing in my ears, I could feel something shifting under my feet. In 30 days, they expected to see me standing on the curb with nowhere to go. They had no idea whose name was already on its way to the deed. The hush in my room that night lasted only a few seconds before the weight of my father's voice settled again in my ears. I could still hear the scrape of his chair, the tightness in his words, and the way my sisters snickered as if eviction were entertainment. The walls around me felt smaller than they had earlier in the day, and for the first time in years, the house that had always felt like familiar ground felt more like a place I was already halfway out of. My parents had boxed up their decision long before dinner, sealing it, without a conversation, handing it to me like an afterthought between bites of roast chicken. The more I replayed it, the more obvious it became that they never expected a reaction from me other than quiet acceptance. I sat up, brushing my hair back from my face, and reached for the same worn laptop I had been carrying with me since college. Its corners were dented, and the keys had a shine to them from how often I pressed them, but the screen still lit up with the soft hum I knew by heart. That laptop had been with me through every project Noah and I built from the ground up, from our first test programs to the early sketches of the software that changed everything. When I clicked open the real estate listing folder on my desktop, the image of my childhood home filled the screen, bright, carefully framed, and unmistakably mine. The first time I found that listing, a wave of disbelief had gone through me so sharply that I had to sit down. Seeing it again now felt surreal for a different reason. Back then, I had stared at the photos room by room, recognizing every mark on the walls and every corner I had grown up around. My old bedroom was captured in one of the shots clothes still resting on the chair books, half stacked on the shelf, as if someone had photographed it midday without warning. They had never mentioned a listing, a buyer, or even the idea of selling. So when I saw those images, something steadier than fear pushed forward in my mind. It was the memory of late nights writing code, of the first time a small business handed me an envelope with real payment inside of every quiet win I had built for myself, while the people downstairs shrugged at my ambition. I knew then that I could step into a future without waiting for their permission. Noah had been the first person I called after that discovery. I remembered the soft click on the second ring and how he asked what had me sounding so alert that late at night. I told him about the listing, about the surprise of seeing the house online, and how the idea of buying it had come to me before I could even think about whether it was sensible. There had been a pause, the kind that stretched long enough to make me uncertain before he let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and disbelief. He said it was bold, that I had every right to consider it, and that if we handled it through the company, no one would ever know. Even over the phone, I could picture him running a hand through his hair, torn between caution and the spark of excitement that always appeared when we stumbled into a new idea. I thought about that call now as I opened the emails we had sent back and forth with the discreet agent. Her name was on the screen, followed by the documents she had prepared, each one marked with the quiet efficiency we needed to keep things private. She never asked why the purchase had to stay anonymous, or why we preferred the company name instead of my own. She simply guided us through every step, keeping her voice steady and her questions minimal, letting the process unfold like a curtain sliding open. While my parents whispered behind closed doors about how this sale would teach me something, the paperwork on my laptop told a different story. Downstairs, I heard the front door open and close. Megan's laughter drifted up the stairwell, followed by Chloe's quick steps across the hardwood floor. For a moment, I stayed still, listening to the rhythm of the house, to the sounds that wrapped around me for most of my life. It didn't feel the same as it had earlier, though. The edges had shifted, the foundation tilting towards something new. I closed the laptop and lay back again, hands folded on my stomach, watching the shadows on the ceiling move as the streetlight outside flickered. There was something grounding about knowing more than the people who believed they were in control of the situation. The next morning, the house was already buzzing. Boxes were stacked near the front door, and rolls of packing tape sat on the kitchen counter. My mom had a list in her hand, her glasses slipping down her nose as she read off items for my dad to grab from the basement. When I stepped into the room, they both went silent for a beat before resuming their tasks without acknowledging me. Megan breezed through the doorway with a half-open suitcase, dropping it on the couch as if the space were already someone else's. Chloe paced behind her, scrolling through her phone and making comments about their new neighborhood, imagining coffee shops and parks that she said would be so much nicer than here. They talked around me as if I were invisible, and every sentence seemed to confirm that their minds were already outside of this house. I asked when they were planning to leave, and my dad answered with a brisk soon, barely glancing up. He told me again that I needed to use my time wisely, that 30 days wasn't much to find a place, and that the new buyers had been clear about wanting possession on schedule. I felt the tug of familiar frustration at his tone, but I let it fall away just as quickly. He didn't need to know what happened behind the scenes. Not yet. As the day went on, I stayed out of their way, slipping into my room to review more of the purchase documents. Each page felt like a step toward something larger than just a house. It was a chance to reclaim space that had never really felt like mine, even when I lived in it every day. When I signed the final set of digital forms that night, the cursor blinking at the bottom of the screen seemed to match the rhythm of my heartbeat. The process wasn't finished yet, but the end wasn't far. The quiet awareness of what was coming sat with me like a steady companion. 2 days later, Noah met me at a small cafe near his apartment, sliding into the booth with a folder tucked under his arm. He passed it to me without a word, letting me flip through the pages he had prepared for the attorney's appointment. Every detail was lined up, every name in place, and the company's information was carefully positioned to ensure my parents would never see my connection to the purchase. We talked over coffee, going through the sequence of events again, making sure everything would move smoothly once the closing date arrived. The people around us talked about their errands, their weekend plans, their children and jobs, and none of them had any idea that a life-changing decision was being quietly finalized just a few feet away. When I returned home, the living room was almost entirely empty. The couches were gone, the pictures removed from the walls, and the echo of footsteps filled the open space. My mom stood near the window looking out at the yard as if memorizing it. My dad supervised the movers as they carried out the last of the furniture. Megan sat on the stairs with her phone pressed to her ear, and Chloe dragged a backpack across the floor. I set my bag down and asked if they were planning to stay the night, and my dad shook his head without looking at me. He said they were leaving within the hour, that the timeline had been set, and that they expected me to start packing soon. I nodded, letting the stillness of the moment settle around us. None of them noticed the way I looked at the walls, at the empty floor, at the stair railing that I had run my hand along 1,000 times while growing up. When the movers closed the truck doors and my family walked out one by one, the house felt different in a way that no words could quite capture. I didn't follow them outside. I didn't watch the car pull away. I simply listened to the quiet that filled the hallway once the front door shut behind them. I walked back up to my room, opened the laptop again, and checked the date on the closing documents. Everything was moving exactly as planned. They believed they were leaving me behind with nothing but a deadline. They had no idea what was waiting for them on the other side of that sale. And as I leaned against the headboard, the warmth of the house settled gently around me, not asking for anything and not promising anything either. It just felt still holding its breath, waiting for what came next. When the last box vanished through the door and the sound of the moving truck faded down the street, the house settled into a quiet I hadn't heard in years. It wasn't the kind that pressed in from all sides or made you feel like you needed to fill it. It was a softer stillness, like the first moment after a storm, when everything is still deciding what comes next. I stood in the middle of the empty living room, letting my eyes follow the streaks of sunlight that reached across the bare floorboards. There were shadows on the walls where pictures used to hang faint traces of the life my parents believed they were taking with them. The air felt lighter without their voices trailing through each room. I walked through the downstairs, slowly letting my hand drift along the banister as I moved up the steps. Every creak under my feet sounded clearer, now more familiar. The upstairs hall felt wider without stacks of laundry waiting to be folded, or the usual traffic of footsteps rushing past. My room looked almost untouched, except for the missing dresser and the open closet door, where a few hangers swayed gently as if someone had brushed past them moments earlier. I stepped inside and sat at the edge of the bed, feeling the mattress dip slightly under my weight. That night the house stayed quiet long after darkness settled outside. I lay awake for a while listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the soft shift of the walls as the temperature dropped. It was strange not to hear Megan's laughter spilling down the hallway or the muffled beat of music coming from Chloe's room. Instead, there was just a spacious kind of silence that followed me from room to room. I didn't turn on the television or play any music. I simply let the stillness fill the space they had left behind. Somewhere between the quiet and the cool air drifting through the curtains, I began to feel the weight of what was coming. Over the next few days, I followed the motions of my routine, but everything around me felt slightly out of alignment. The morning started with coffee at the kitchen counter, the light coming in from the window over the sink. Most days I opened my laptop, reviewed the latest updates from NOAA, and checked on our contracts. Our software kept moving forward steady as always. Yet each time I walked from my room to the kitchen or down the hall to grab something from the linen closet, the emptiness around me reminded me of what had pushed me into this moment. The house carried a quiet echo of conversations that had never reached me and decisions that had never included my name. One afternoon, as I sat at the dining table reviewing invoices, my eyes drifted toward the window. The yard looked the same stretch of grass, same maple leaves scattered near the walkway, but without my family's cars in the driveway, the place felt almost new. I remembered how years ago my parents would gather relatives for birthdays or holiday dinners, setting out platters across the table while I helped bring out chairs for cousins and uncles. Even then, I had often felt more like an assistant than part of the celebration. I spent most of those nights moving plates, pouring drinks, or disappearing to my room once the laughter became too loud to navigate. The memory lingered for a moment before drifting off like dust, settling back to the floor. Later that week, I found myself back in my room, sitting at my desk with the blinds half open. The closing date on the house was approaching quickly, and each time I glanced at the calendar, I felt a quiet flutter in my chest. It was a feeling I couldn't quite name. Not anxiety, not relief, but something suspended between the two. Part of me had always expected to leave this house once my parents made it clear they wanted space from me, but the truth was, they hadn't offered a choice. They had made the decision without knowing what was happening just outside their view. Noah called one evening while I was sorting through a stack of documents. His voice came through the speaker with the easy kind of steadiness that always followed him even on the busiest days. He asked if I had everything I needed for the appointment, whether the attorney had confirmed the timeline, and if I was doing all right with the house being so empty. I listened for a moment before answering, letting his questions land in the quiet room. He didn't rush me. He never did. I told him I was prepared, that everything was moving forward, and that the silence took some getting used to. He said something about how every transition felt strange until it didn't anymore. His words stayed with me long after we ended the call. The night before the closing, I sat in the living room with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The room was dim except for a small lamp near the corner. I didn't switch on the brighter ceiling light. Instead, I watched the edges of the room fade gently into shadows, each one softening the parts of the space that had carried so much tension for so long. I thought of all the arguments that had played out here, all the conversations in which my voice never carried much weight. Somehow, sitting in that quiet glow made it easier to breathe. By morning, the house felt still again. I walked through it one more time before leaving for the attorney's office. I paused by the front window, and then at the base of the stairs, letting my eyes move over the details one last time before the change became official. The drive to the appointment was calm, the kind of calm that settles in when you know the next step will shift everything, even if no one else sees it happening. When I arrived, Noah was already waiting near the entrance with a folder in his hand. He greeted me with a nod and a quiet smile, then held the door open as we stepped inside. The meeting moved efficiently, each signature bringing the process closer to the end. There were no dramatic moments, no surprises, just the steady rhythm of pen to paper and the closing of folders as each document was finalized. By the time we stepped back out into the parking lot, the house was legally under my company's name. Noah stood beside me for a moment before heading toward his car, leaving me in the gentle warmth of the late morning sun. Driving home, the roads felt familiar, but the destination felt different. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment with my hands loosely wrapped around the steering wheel. The house looked the same from the outside, with its faded shutters and the maple trees swaying slightly in the breeze, but something had shifted beneath the surface. When I opened the front door, the air inside greeted me like a quiet exhale. I walked through each room again, not because I needed to check anything, but because the space felt new in a way I couldn't quite describe. Every corner seemed touched by possibility now, every empty wall ready for something different. As I reached the top of the stairs and stepped back into my room, a soft sense of certainty settled through me. This house wasn't an anchor anymore. It wasn't a reminder of who I had been in their eyes. It was something else entirely, a space waiting to be claimed, reshaped, and lived in on my own terms. Standing there in the doorway, I knew the hardest part wasn't the sale or the silence that followed. It was the moment ahead when the people who believed they had cast me aside would walk back through that door and realize the home they left behind no longer belonged to them. The morning after the closing sunlight spread across the hallway in a soft glow, the kind that warmed the floors even before the day fully settled in. I stepped out of my room and stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet sink in. It felt different from the silence of the past week. This one carried a steady weight to it, as if the house itself were adjusting to everything that had shifted beneath its foundation. I moved through the hallway and paused by each open door, noticing the way the walls held on to faint memories without pulling at me the way they used to. It was the first time in years I felt the house wasn't pushing me aside. Later that morning, I stood at the kitchen counter with a mug warming my hands. The sky outside was just beginning to brighten, and the yard was still damp from the early dew. I watched a bird hop along the fence, its colors muted in the early light. There was something calming about knowing no one would be rushing down the stairs asking for rides or arguing over breakfast. For once, the house seemed to breathe at a slower pace, matching the steadiness that had taken root inside me. I opened my laptop and checked through messages from Noah, confirming small updates to our projects. Each notification came with a quiet reassurance that life was moving forward one step at a time. By midday, I walked room to room again, letting my feet find the familiar paths they had stepped for decades. Each space held a different echo now. The dining room didn't feel like the backdrop to years of clipped conversations or tense dinners. The living room felt larger, as if it had finally stretched out once the last of the furniture was gone. The house wasn't empty, it was open. and with each lap through the downstairs, I began imagining ways to fill it, not with memories of what used to be expected of me, but with pieces of a life built on my own choices. In the afternoon, a light breeze slipped through the cracked kitchen window, carrying the faint scent of cut grass from somewhere down the street. I made a sandwich, sat at the table, and let the quiet hum of the fridge settle into the background. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider what it meant to own the place that had shaped so many of my early years. The thought didn't feel heavy. Instead, it felt steady and grounded, like something that had been waiting its turn. The next day, I drove to a nearby home store and walked through the aisles without any particular plan. I touched fabric swatches, glanced through kitchen sets, and paused at displays that showed rooms filled with soft colors and warm lighting. I didn't buy anything that day. Instead, I collected ideas, letting myself picture what this house could look like when the pieces finally came together. Walking out to the parking lot, bags left behind, I realized this was the first time I had ever looked at my childhood home not as a place I might leave someday, but as a place I could reshape. Later in the week, I invited Noah over to look at the house with a fresh set of eyes. When he stepped through the doorway, he let out a whistle under his breath and scanned the open rooms with slow steps. He didn't say much right away, just walked from one corner to another, tapping his knuckles along walls and lifting blinds to check the light. I followed him quietly, watching him take in the space the way he always approached new challenges, with patience and curiosity. When he finally turned toward me, he nodded, saying the layout had potential and the house had good bones. It was the kind of reassurance that settled easily in my chest. We spent the next hour walking through each room, looking at possibilities without pushing decisions. In the living room, he suggested the best place for a couch, marking the corner with an easy gesture. In the kitchen, he pointed out where new shelves might fit, or where a small island could bring the space together. Upstairs, he paused by the window in my room, admiring the view of the maple tree that had grown thicker and taller over the years. He said it would catch the best light in the late afternoon. I watched the way the sunlight hit the branches, making the leaves shimmer like a soft mosaic. When Noah left that evening, the house felt fuller, not from furniture or noise, but from the possibilities he had left behind. I stood at the front door after he drove off, letting the soft hum of the evening settle in. The sky outside had shifted from blue to a gentle wash of lavender, and a thin crescent moon hovered low on the horizon. The air was still warm from the day, but there was a faint coolness hinting at the change in season. As the week passed, I began setting small things in motion. I ordered a few pieces of furniture, nothing large, just what I needed to make the living room comfortable and the kitchen more functional. When deliveries arrived, I opened the boxes with measured steps, assembling each piece myself and placing them carefully where they felt right. There was something grounding about building a home, detail by detail, without rushing or worrying about how it looked to anyone else. Each small addition softened the emptiness, further filling the house with a calm rhythm. One morning, I stood in the living room with a patch of sunlight warming the floor at my feet. The sectional had arrived the day before, and I had placed it near the window where the light came in strongest. I sank into the cushions, letting the fabric settle under my weight. Across the room, the new lamp cast a gentle glow against the corner wall. There was a sense of belonging in that moment that I hadn't felt in years. It was subtle and steady, like a whisper reminding me that I had the space to breathe now. In the evenings, I kept the lights low and played soft music from a small speaker on the shelf. The house took on a quiet warmth as the hours passed, the kind that made the air feel thick with comfort. I would sit with my legs tucked beneath me, scrolling through project updates or reading messages from Noah, letting the gentle hum of the house fold around me. Each night I felt the walls unwind a little more, releasing old tension and making room for something different. One night as I stood in the hallway, I let my fingers glide along the railing again. The wood felt smooth beneath my hand, the curve familiar from years of climbing those stairs. I paused halfway up and looked toward the front door, letting the soft glow from the streetlight spill into the entryway. The house no longer felt like a place where I had been overlooked. It felt like a place waiting for whatever came next. With each passing day, the ache of what had happened at that dinner eased into something quieter. It wasn't that the words were forgotten, but they no longer sat as heavily on me as they once had. The house had begun to absorb the noise of the past and replace it with a gentler kind of stillness. In that space, I found a kind of clarity that made it easier to recognize how far I had already come. As the final week of September settled in, the air turned cooler, and the maple leaves began to shift to soft shades of gold. I stood at the window one evening, watching them flutter to the ground, the branches swaying in a slow rhythm. A long breath left my chest steady and calm. I didn't know exactly when the next chapter would begin, but the sense of waiting had changed. It wasn't a fear anymore. It was something else, something close to anticipation. And as I watched the last bit of daylight fade behind the trees, I knew the quiet days would not last much longer. The moment when everything shifted was closer than it appeared, waiting just outside the front door. The shift in the seasons arrived almost overnight. One morning the air held the last warmth of summer, and the next it carried a crispness that made the leaves tremble on the branches outside my bedroom window. I woke with the sun filtering through the curtains and realized it had been nearly a full month since my family drove away, believing they'd left me counting down the days. The knowledge that the house now belonged entirely to me settled quietly beneath everything I did, giving even the simplest routines a steadier rhythm. I walked down the hallway and paused by the railing, letting my hand rest lightly against the smooth wood. The stillness of the house made it easy to hear my own steps, a soft reminder that life was finally moving at a pace I chose. That morning I made coffee and carried the mug into the living room, settling onto the new couch that fit perfectly against the window. The fabric had already grown familiar beneath my hands, and the room no longer felt like an empty shell of what it used to be. The sunlight stretched across the floor, casting a warm glow over the small details I had placed there: a lamp with a soft amber shade, a stack of neatly arranged books, and a woven throw that added a quiet texture to the space. I pulled my legs up under me and opened my laptop, reviewing overnight messages from Noah and confirming updates on the contracts we were finalizing. Everything about the morning felt calm, measured, and somehow more mine than any moment had felt in years. After sending a few replies, I closed the laptop and allowed myself a rare pause. The room around me hummed with the beginnings of a life I had been building in pieces, and for the first time I could feel it taking shape. I walked to the kitchen and ran my hand along the counter, thinking about the errands I needed to run that afternoon. Simple things. New shelves for the hallway, a set of plates I had been debating for days, maybe a few plants to brighten some of the corners. These small choices added color to the house-filling spaces that once felt overshadowed by memories that didn't belong to me anymore. Later that afternoon, I drove to a home store a few towns over. The aisles were lined with autumn decor, warm earth tones, and shelves stocked with items that made each room feel like it could hold its own story. I wandered slowly through the displays, pausing at a soft charcoal rug and a set of cream-colored curtains. I touched different textures, letting instinct guide me more than any design trend. There was no rush. The house would grow into itself as I grew into it, piece by piece. I left with a few small items tucked into bags, the kind of additions that didn't demand attention, but offered a quiet presence. When I returned home, the late afternoon light had shifted into a gentler shade, the sky beginning to dim. I placed each item where it felt most natural and stepped back to let the room speak for itself. The house was changing in subtle ways, and with every adjustment, it felt less like a place I grew up trying to find space in, and more like a place that welcomed me fully. I opened the windows to let in the cool air, allowing the steady rustle of leaves outside to soften the edges of the silence. As evening settled in, I moved upstairs to check the progress of a small corner I planned to turn into a reading nook. A new armchair had been delivered 2 days earlier, and a small side table was still wrapped in packaging near the wall. I unboxed it slowly, savoring the unhurried pace, and assembled the pieces until everything fit neatly together. When I finally slid the table beside the chair and placed a lamp on top, the glow that settled into the corner felt warm and steady. I sat down and let the quiet wrap around me like a familiar blanket. The next morning, I drove to Noah's apartment to pick him up for a meeting we had scheduled downtown. He stepped out of the building with a folder under his arm and an easy smile on his face. As he climbed into the passenger seat, he asked how the house was coming along. I told him about the shelves, the new chair, and the slow process of turning each room into something inviting. He nodded, saying he'd stop by again soon to see how everything was coming together. We talked about work as I drove, going over tasks for the day and making notes about a few ideas we wanted to expand. The meeting went smoothly, and afterward we shared a late lunch in a quiet cafe tucked between two brick buildings downtown. On the way back, he leaned against the window, watching the trees pass by in shades of gold and rust. He mentioned how different everything looked compared to the summer months, how change always seemed to arrive quietly and then suddenly become impossible to ignore. His words lingered with me as I dropped him off and made the drive home alone. The trees along my street were beginning to shed their leaves, leaving small patches of orange and yellow scattered across the sidewalk. When I pulled into the driveway, the house greeted me with the same steady comfort it had grown into over the past weeks. I carried my bag inside and set it on the counter before flipping on the small lamp near the entryway. The soft glow spread across the floor, warming the atmosphere that had once felt cold and uninviting. I stood there for a moment, taking in the simple details I had chosen, the ones that quietly marked my presence in the home. That evening I cooked a small dinner and sat at the dining table listening to the faint hum of the heater as it clicked on. The warmth filled the room in gentle waves, smoothing the lingering coolness that had settled earlier in the day. I ate a few bites and then rested my fork on the plate, glancing toward the living room and the staircase beyond. The house felt calm, grounded, and ready for whatever came next. As the days passed, I settled into a quiet routine that felt both familiar and new. Mornings began with the same warm cup of coffee in the kitchen, and evenings with soft light in the living room. I worked steadily, filled the house with small touches of comfort, and let the slow rhythm of the season guide me. I didn't dwell on the past or anticipate the future too sharply. Instead, I allowed myself to enjoy the simple gift of space I had created. One crisp Friday afternoon, I took a walk through the neighborhood, letting my thoughts drift with the sound of leaves crunching under my shoes. Families decorated their porches with pumpkins and wreaths, and a few neighbors worked in their yards. I turned the corner and paused when I reached the end of the street. The wind carried a faint scent of wood smoke, and the sky was stretching into shades of pale blue and soft pink. I stayed there for a few seconds, breathing in the cool air before making my way home. When I stepped through the front door that evening, a quiet feeling settled in my chest, something steady and grounded. The house was warm, the lights gentle, and for the first time in a long while, the idea of being alone didn't feel heavy. It felt like space to grow, to breathe, and to choose what came next. As I climbed the stairs to my room, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar tension behind the sound. I picked it up and glanced at the screen. The message preview showed only a few words, but they struck with enough weight to still my steps. I opened it slowly, reading the full sentence as the hallway remained quiet around me. The words came from a number I knew well, a number I had avoided for weeks. And with that single message, the peaceful rhythm I had settled into began to shift, making room for the moment I knew had been waiting on the horizon. My phone buzzed again as I stood in the hallway, the glow of the screen casting a soft light across my hand. The preview of the message stayed fixed at the top. "Why are you still there?" For a moment, everything around me went still, the house as quiet and steady as it had been for weeks. I opened the message fully, and the short line stared back at me with the clipped tone I knew too well. It was from my father's number, and the timing told me more than the words ever could. I stood there, letting the phone dim in my hand before pocketing it and walking toward my bedroom. The rest of the evening carried a muted weight, the kind that hovered at the edge of each movement I made. I tried returning to the reading nook I had set up only days before, but the message lingered in the back of my mind, shifting the air around me. Outside the window, the wind rustled through the branches of the maple tree, scattering a handful of golden leaves across the lawn. I watched them fall, each one turning slowly before settling into place. It surprised me how calm the moment felt, despite everything the message implied. The next morning, the sky was a clean sweep of pale blue, and sunlight crept across the carpet as I opened the curtains. I moved through the house with a steadiness that felt both practiced and new, preparing coffee and reviewing the list of work tasks Noah and I had planned for the day. I sent a brief update to him, then set the phone face down on the counter. It buzzed once more, and the vibration echoed lightly against the surface. I didn't look at it right away. Instead, I carried my coffee into the living room and let the warm light settle over the couch. When I finally picked up the phone, the message was short. "We need to come by this afternoon." The lack of explanation told me exactly how much urgency they felt. The day carried a different rhythm from that point on. I worked through emails and reviewed documents, but every few minutes I found myself glancing toward the front window. The house seemed to sense the shift, holding its breath, in a way that made even the quiet seem sharper. By early afternoon, I had prepared as much as I needed to straighten a few things in the living room, folded a blanket across the back of the couch, and opened the blinds to let more sunlight in. I didn't intend to perform for anyone, but I wanted the house to feel like itself. A little after 3, the sound of a car eased into the driveway tires, rolling across the small patch of gravel near the sidewalk. I stood smoothing the front of my sweater and walked toward the entryway. Through the glass, I saw all 4 of them walking up the steps. My father led the way with a stiff posture, my mother a half step behind him, wringing her hands together. Megan and Chloe followed closely, their eyes sweeping over the house as if expecting to see unfamiliar boxes stacked by the door. When I opened it, they hesitated for a brief moment, surprised to see me standing there with a calm expression. I stepped aside and gestured for them to come in. They moved through the doorway slowly, their eyes drifting over the living room. The soft colors, the polished wood floor, the new furniture, every detail made them pause. Megan walked farther in her gaze, drifting to the lamp and the neatly arranged shelves. Chloe turned toward the couch, brushing her fingers lightly along the cushions. It was my mother who spoke first, her voice tight with confusion. "Lauren, how are you still living here? The new owners should have taken possession weeks ago." My father shifted behind her, his eyes narrowing slightly as he scanned the room. "We need answers," he said, his voice low but firm. "This isn't making sense." I walked toward the couch and sat down, resting my hands on my knees. The 3 of them remained standing, watching me with a mix of uncertainty and impatience. I let the silence hold for a few moments before speaking. "I'm still here because the house belongs to me." The words didn't land right away. It took a few seconds for each of them to register what I had said. My mother blinked rapidly, her mouth parting in surprise. Megan stared at me as if she hadn't heard correctly. Chloe looked between the 3 of us, her expression tight with confusion. My father's brows drew together, disbelief settling across his face. "That's not possible," he finally said. "We sold this house to a company." "The paperwork," I nodded gently. "The company purchased it. My company." My mother reached for the back of a chair, steadying herself as her voice thinned. What do you mean, your company?" "I mean the business I built with Noah. The one you never asked about." I kept my tone steady, letting each word fall clearly. "We bought the house. It's in the company's name, and I hold the majority ownership." The room fell quiet again. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the heater turning on. My father took a slow step forward, studying my face as if trying to make sense of what he saw. "You expect us to believe you had that kind of money?" he asked. I met his gaze without pausing. "We sold a system contract months ago. The deal changed everything." Megan let out a sharp breath, her voice rising just slightly. "So you're rich?" "Just like that, I'm comfortable," I replied softly. "More than I ever expected to be, and more than any of you ever knew." My mother pressed a hand to her forehead, her voice trembling. "Lauren, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you say anything?" I held her gaze, but I didn't move toward her. "There was nothing I needed to reach for anymore. You never asked, and you never listened." She lowered her eyes, her shoulders folding in on themselves. My father shook his head slowly, the tightness in his jaw returning as he tried to find footing in a conversation that no longer belonged to him. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Nothing," I said. "You have your home, your plans, your new life, and I have mine." Chloe stepped closer, her voice unsteady. "Can't we talk about this?" I looked at her gently, aware of how much had gone unsaid over the years. "We are talking, and I'm telling you the truth." My mother wiped at the corner of her eye, her voice cracking as she spoke again. "We didn't know things would end up like this." "I know," I replied quietly. "You didn't." My father shifted, opening his mouth to speak, but I lifted a hand slightly, not to silence him, but to steady the moment. "This house isn't a bargaining chip. It's not leverage. It's not something you can claim. You left it behind. I chose to stay." The words settled like a soft blanket over the room, gentle and firm at the same time. No one responded right away. They stood there, each processing the shift in a different way, each feeling the walls of the house differently now that they understood it was no longer theirs to claim. After a long pause, my mother asked in a quiet voice, "Do you want us to leave?" I glanced toward the window, watching a leaf drift past the glass, before settling toward the ground. Then I looked back at her and nodded once slowly. "I think that's best for today." My father hesitated, but he didn't argue. Megan and Chloe followed them toward the door, quieter than they had been in years. Before stepping outside, my mother turned back, her expression soft and uncertain. "Lauren, we'll talk again. We have to." I didn't answer. I simply held her gaze until she stepped outside and the door closed behind them. I stood there for a long moment, my hand resting lightly on the doorknob. The house felt different again, lighter and heavier at the same time, as if it had taken a deep breath. And somewhere beneath that stillness, I could sense the next moment forming, waiting quietly on the horizon. Whatever came next wouldn't be quiet, and it wouldn't wait long. The door clicked softly behind them, and I stood there for a moment longer, feeling the quiet settle back into the house. The shift in the air felt noticeable, as if the place itself had paused to take stock of what had just happened. I walked toward the living room with slow, measured steps and sat down on the couch, letting the silence surround me. The meeting had been tense, and the truth had landed heavier than even I expected. But underneath all of it, there was a steady calm moving through me, one that didn't feel fragile or uncertain. I stayed there until the light outside grew dimmer, watching the shadows stretch across the floor as the afternoon slipped into evening. The next morning I woke earlier than usual. Sunlight streamed through the curtains in soft lines, warming the room with gentle brightness. I rolled out of bed, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders with each small movement. I knew that conversation with my parents hadn't been the end of anything. It had simply brought everything into clearer focus. Downstairs, the house welcomed me back with familiar warmth. I brewed coffee and leaned against the counter while it filled the kitchen with its steady, comforting aroma. As I sipped from the mug, my phone buzzed again. I didn't rush to pick it up. I placed the cup down and wiped my hand on a dish towel before reaching for the device. The screen lit with a new message. It was from my father, but this time the tone felt different. The text was longer, more hesitant, asking if we could talk things through and suggesting they stop by later that week. I exhaled through my nose and set the phone aside. There was no frustration or confusion in me, just a gentle understanding that the day I had expected was finally approaching. I spent the next few days settling back into my usual routines. Work stayed steady with updates from Noah coming through our shared channel. We had a new contract lined up with a mid-sized company we'd been speaking with for months, and we spent hours fine-tuning the presentation we planned to deliver. At home, I added a few new touches to the rooms that still felt unfinished. A framed print for the hallway, a warm-toned runner for the stairs, and a small plant for the reading nook upstairs. Each one softened the edges of the space even more. One evening near the middle of the week, I stepped out onto the front porch to shake out a small rug. The air carried the cool scent of early fall, and the sky stretched wide and pale. I stood there for a moment, enjoying the quiet before heading back inside. That was when a car slowed at the curb. I recognized it immediately. My parents' sedan came to a stop beside the mailbox, and a moment later the passenger door opened. My mother stepped out first, smoothing her jacket as she looked toward the house. My father followed, his posture stiff and his expression unreadable. Megan and Chloe got out after them, quieter than I had ever seen them. They all stood there for a moment hesitating. Then they began walking toward me. I stayed where I was, my hand still lightly resting on the porch railing. When they reached the bottom step, my father cleared his throat. "Lauren," he said, his voice gentler than before, "we need to talk, all of us." I nodded once, then stepped aside to let them in. They moved carefully through the living room, taking in the space with a kind of quiet awe. The new sectional, the warm lighting, the thoughtful touches, it all silenced the room for a moment. My mother finally sank into one of the chairs, her hands laced together tightly. "Lauren," she began, looking at the floor before raising her eyes to mine. "We didn't come back to argue. We came because we realized things have gone too far." My father shifted beside her, clearing his throat again. "We made mistakes," he said. "A lot of them, and we should have handled things differently." Megan sat down on the edge of the couch, pushing her hair behind her ear. "We didn't know everything you had going on," she murmured. "We didn't realize you were doing all this on your own." Chloe nodded slowly, her usual sharpness gone. "We never knew about your company." I walked to the other side of the living room and took a seat, letting the room settle before I spoke. "I've been building my life quietly for a long time," I said. "I didn't expect anyone to notice, and I stopped waiting for it." My mother flinched a little, her voice softening. "We should have noticed. We should have appreciated you differently." My father leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "We want to make things right," he said. "We're asking for a chance to do better." I listened to each of them carefully, letting their words land without rushing to respond. The house stayed quiet in the background, holding the moment gently without judgment or pressure. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady and calm. "Making things right doesn't mean pretending the past never happened," I said. "And it doesn't mean we return to how things were. But if you truly want to do better, it starts with respecting the boundaries I set." My father nodded slowly. "What does that look like?" "It starts with space," I answered. "Real space, and honest conversations when they're needed." My mother bit her lip, then nodded. "We can do that." Megan leaned back slightly, her expression gentler. "We want to understand you better. We really do." For the next hour, we talked through the years that had shaped us, the misunderstandings, and the distance none of us had tried hard enough to cross. There were no sharp words, no raised voices, just steady, careful conversation that moved across the room in quiet waves. When their questions drifted toward my work, I shared enough to give them clarity, but not more than I was ready for. It wasn't the full picture, but it was enough to show that I had built something solid. When the conversation began to wind down, my father stood first. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving us the time today." My mother followed him to the door, turning to look at me with a hopeful expression. "We'd like to see you again, when you're ready." I gave a small nod, feeling the gentleness in the moment rather than the weight. "I'll let you know." They stepped outside one by one, each offering a quiet goodbye. When the door closed, the house fell into silence again, but it felt different, lighter, more open. I stood there with my hand still on the doorknob, letting the quiet fill the space. The shift wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't sudden. It was just steady and real, settling into the house the way evening light settles into familiar corners. And even as the air calmed around me, I knew one final moment still waited ahead, the one that would close the last chapter of this long, complicated story. The house was quiet after they left, the kind of quiet that filled every corner without feeling heavy. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting the stillness settle around me. The late afternoon light stretched across the floor in thin bands, warming the space where my family had stood only minutes earlier. Their visit had carried emotions I never expected to hear from them, and the weight of those conversations lingered gently in the room. I walked to the couch and lowered myself onto the cushions, feeling the house breathe with me as the day slowly drifted toward evening. Over the next few days, I moved through the house with a steadier rhythm. The message they brought, the acknowledgement, the questions, the small steps toward understanding, didn't erase the past, but it softened something inside me. I noticed it in small ways. My shoulders didn't tense when my phone buzzed. The memories that used to tighten my chest felt a little farther away, as if time had given them a softer outline. I wasn't expecting everything to change at once, and I didn't need it to. I simply wanted space to feel the shift, and the quiet gave me room to do just that. One afternoon, as the sky turned a soft shade of gold, I stepped into the yard and watched the maple leaves fall in gentle spirals. The breeze moved through the branches with a slow, unhurried whisper. I stood there with my hands tucked into my pockets, thinking about how different my life looked from the one I had imagined in my early 20s. Back then, I believed stability depended on being accepted by the people who raised me. Now, standing in the yard of the home I owned, I could see how much strength had come from learning to stand on my own. Later that evening, as I settled into the reading nook I had built, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Aunt Rita. She asked how I was doing, if things had gone smoothly, and whether I needed anything. I typed back a short reply telling her everything was fine and that the conversation with my parents had been honest and calm. Her response came a moment later, full of warmth. She said she was proud of the way I had handled the past months, proud of the way I had found my footing without bitterness carving its way through me. Her words touched a quiet part of me that still needed reassurance. As night settled around the house, I walked downstairs and paused at the bottom step. The living room glowed softly from the lamp near the window, casting warm tones across the rug and walls. The house no longer felt like something I had to survive. It was a place I could grow, and a place I could breathe, and a place I could choose who to let in. That choice meant everything now. A week later, my parents reached out again, this time with a message that carried more gratitude than fear or uncertainty. They didn't ask for anything. They simply thanked me for giving them the chance to speak and for listening. I read the message twice before setting the phone down. I didn't feel pressure to respond immediately. I knew I would, but only when I felt ready. Healing didn't rush forward, it moved at its own pace, just like the early steps of growth. In the weeks that followed, life found a comfortable balance. Noah and I secured another contract for our company, and our small team expanded with 2 new programmers who brought an energy that renewed our pace. At home, the rooms continued to take shape, each one reflecting a different part of who I was becoming. Sometimes I would pause in the middle of the hallway and look around, surprised by how peaceful the house felt now. It was no longer a place tied to childhood or old wounds. It was a reflection of the choices I had made and the life I was building. On a quiet Sunday morning, I sat on the porch with a warm mug between my hands and watched a neighbor walk her dog down the street. The sun rose slowly, lighting the rooftops in soft layers. I breathed in the crisp air, letting the warmth from the cup seep into my palms. In that moment, I felt a kind of clarity that had been just out of reach for years. Everything my family had taken for granted, the roof over my head, the sense of belonging, the respect I had hoped for had found its way back to me, but through my own efforts, not theirs. What surprised me most was how calm that truth felt. There wasn't triumph or resentment, just a steady sense of knowing. I didn't need to prove myself anymore. I didn't need their validation to fill any empty spaces. I had rebuilt myself in a way that gave me more than they ever could have handed me. And now I finally understood that sometimes the peace we search for doesn't come from being accepted. It comes from accepting ourselves and the life we choose to create. As the morning sun lifted higher, I realized the house felt like home for the first time in years, not because of its walls or rooms, but because of the sense of dignity and quiet resilience I had finally claimed. Whatever happened with my family in the future, whether we moved closer or stayed at a distance, I knew I had already found the strength I needed. Thank you for listening to my story. If it reminded you of your own journey toward strength, or helped you feel a little less alone, feel free to share your thoughts or subscribe for more stories like this.